Today, designing modern board games based on George Philly's forthcoming book, A Class in Board Game Design. Lecture 18, Thoughts of the Great Designers. This lecture is a bit different than other lectures in the course in that it really treats not how one might design a game, but what other game designers have said about the topic. The volume on modern perspectives in game design is close to 180,000 words. Most of it is interviews with other game designers and their opinions on what you should do to design a game or to deal with game design topics. The volume, Designing Modern Strategy Games, includes in the back a set of very short comments, epigrams from various game designers. The best I can do in an hour of time is to present a few of their more interesting suggestions, point out places where they tend to agree with each other, and then leave to the student the task of reading the rest of the assembled wisdom. So if this lecture appears to be a little less centrally organized and coherent, it's because I'm trying to do something very different. I'm trying to introduce what a cacophony of voices of other designers, many of whom don't agree with each other, have said about designing good games. I hope you get something good out of it. In any event, today two sorts of things are happening. First, and we did this off camera because it is a little noisy and clumsy and slow, we have in front of me, hiding behind the camera, no fewer than 7 game design groups. And the 7 game design groups are now moving to the first stage of playtesting. The first stage of playtesting is you all take the game, you hand it over to the next group, and tomorrow each of the groups given the new game, plus one member from the design group, are going to try to play the game. And this is where you discover all of the interesting things about the design that, well, hey, it's a first effort. Most of the efforts, I am sure, will turn out to be quite solid. The design groups have several important tasks. The first task is to compare the game with the design specifications provided in the syllabus and make sure the game has an exploration element, multi-level economics, a cooperative element of some sort, a competitive element of some sort of a tech tree where tech tree can be very broadly meant, and the other things that the game is supposed to have. It should also work for 4 or 3 players. There are 2 groups with 5 players, and therefore it may not include everyone each time. And what you are supposed to try to do is to get the game off and running and provide feedback to the person from the design group who is playing with you. And that person is presumably going to be busy taking notes, talking into their telephone, or whatever recording method you want. One of the nice features of modern electronics is that you can do a lot more recording and commenting on what you just learned, even if you have to make transcripts later on. And so the storage of information has gotten a lot easier. So that is the first general comment. And so what you're going to be doing tomorrow, that will be the lab exercise, is actually trying playtesting for the first time. The second part of today's lecture is quite different, and I described it very loosely in the syllabus as advice of great designers. One matter you should recognize is the interviews of the great designers were all done by my good friend Tom Vazel, and Tom has the interesting feature that his interest is in Eurogames, not board war games. So if you look at that, all those interviews with great designers, well, you don't perhaps quite see Rainer Knizia because the schedule, I gather, was 3 years in advance. You don't see Jim Dunnigan or anyone else in that line, people who do board war games. You almost exclusively see interviews with designers of Eurogames. Eurogames, of course, are defined substantially by their shape. And the shape is, you can play it in an evening. The rules are not too complicated for grandmom and granddad to learn reasonably quickly. The rules are simple enough so that if the youngest of the children is, only 7 or 8, they can get into the game, even if their strategies are sometimes creative. And so the advice you're getting from game designers in some respects does not necessarily match the only way to design games. Of course, this course is about Eurogame design, so it's probably good advice for designing within the narrow context of this course. So what sort of advice do you get? Well, from several people you get the important message, don't quit your day job. That is, it's very nice to design board games. You can learn a lot from them, but a full-time career as a board game, a Eurogame designer, is not going to happen to most people. Though, of course, if you were the fellow for whose game the Dutch translation, after it was available in English, French, and German, sold 500,000 copies, your situation may be a bit different. From the standpoint of this being, for most of you, interactive media and game development, though, the point of board games is not, we'll do a board game, per se. It's, there are an enormous number of mechanisms, ideas, approaches to producing something that is a game that is very definitely not yet another first-person shooter in which usually someone has remembered to change the artwork from the last game. Well, usually anyhow. Only occasionally are you going to march along through a medieval forest and a tank will wander across because something got missed. So the net notion is, core use of this for many of you is mind consciousness raising. It's broadening your minds on things that can be done that are not the same as what you would do if you were, as Greg Stikian put it, a vidiot. Don't be a vidiot. Okay, having said this, we will in fact be doing board war games at the end of the course, and there will be 3 or 4 lectures on hex encounter board war games, which are kind of the other end in complexity from Eurogames, as you will see. So what advice do we get? And if you go through those interviews, there is a single unified common theme. And the theme is play test. The more play testers you can find, the better. The more different types of play testers you can find, the better. There are a certain number of people whose idea of play testing is to inflict their game on their 5 nearest relatives, maybe not including parents or brothers or sisters, and you will discover you will get praise to the heaven no matter how awful your game is, because that's the way most relatives are. Now, you will occasionally get a relative who can give you good advice, but you don't want to count on it. Having a regular circle of play testers can be a very good thing. Play testing with other designers works if you remember one minor detail. If you want them to play test your game, golden rule, you must be willing to vigorously play test their games, which will be somewhat different from yours, and then you, to some extent, exchange ideas, and you exchange loopholes, and you'll discover there are people who are very good at finding missing sentences, and people who are very good at finding the magic strategy that is the ideal solution to the game because the game has a solution. That's just not good. And there are people who will give you all sorts of good critiques. One challenge, and this is where the art track is actually different from what most poor, benighted game designers out there will encounter. Because you are here and not there, you actually have a number of people in this room who are perfectly good artists who will be able to, even for your mock-ups your original design to give you good, solid artwork. And in fact, there is a piece of advice there that is, if you are going to play test something, you want to have something that is solid, that is attractive, that does not look like we will scribble in ballpoint pen on the back side of a box in order to draw the grid. I have seen this done. The unit counters will be things you can pick up. And that's actually important if you're going to be moving a lot of unit counters around the map. For example, if you're going to have 45 meeple each, that's a legitimate possibility, because the game is the visitation of the pacifist Mongol hordes of tourists out to buy your country. You really want to be able to handle it. At the bottom end, you will get people who will do things on plain paper, maybe not even colored, so you can't tell different species of meeple apart. And at some point, you have to say, this is unplayable junk, give it up, give us something decent. There are several traditional ways of getting solid weighted objects. The simplest or one simple-minded one is to take pennies and tape the object or use mailing labels, which you cut up, print on the mailing label, cut up, roll it onto the penny, it will stick, the penny will give it nice solid weight, 1/10 of an ounce, very accurately too, and you will have something that actually works. And that is also true for the map. It's a basic issue in terms of playtesting that you want things to go. This is not me. I am quoting the designers. And there are a whole stack of designers out there with very different opinions on what you should be doing. You will catch Andrea Mayer lamenting that there are no books or classes or whatever on game design. You sort of have to go here and there and talk to designers and pick things up. You guys are ahead of the curve on this. But nonetheless, there is a lot of stuff that is not written down or is written down very shallowly. It is like reading the book on computer game design. Stuck in the middle is a chapter on board war games. The best that can be said for the chapter on board war games is that it's usually only ludicrously wrong, not totally crazy. Nonetheless, you should realize just because something's written down doesn't make it right. So as I say, I am chugging through our designers, and I am now going to grab this so I keep track of what I want to say. And we now ask, well, suppose we want a game or a good game. What is going to give us a good game? And one traditional answer is socialization. That is, people get together and they are going to play a game, but part of it is an excuse to see each other and do other things. Now, one perspective on this is you can say if the turns are too long, it is really dull for everyone except the person making the move. The other version of this is that if the turns are reasonably long, everyone else can be talking quietly while the person making the move is thinking. And there, of course, if there's trading or other interactions, you have things to do. So socialization is actually fairly traditional. Then there are several people, including Greg Kostikian, who talk about narrative tension. Narrative tension is a literary concept like voice. And the sort of idea of narrative tension is that things become more and more dramatic until the end of the book. The bottom end of the book is the old-style American short story. American short stories were basically wrecked by a fellow by the name of O. Henry, who wrote short stories which always, without exception, had a surprise ending, and inflicted on American readers, poor defenseless high school students, the idea that a short story had to have a surprise ending or it was no good. And since many great short stories do not fit this description at all, he had basically turned the people who fell for this into the 19th or early 20th equivalent of the Vidiot, someone who had an idea of what a short story should be and didn't think there was anything else. I am not saying that it is impossible for there to be even novel-length things in which the drama rises all of the way to the very end of the book. There is a wonderful David Weber novel, military science fiction, Ashes of Victory, and at the very end there is this unpleasant scene in which there's a certain amount of shooting, and then one of the people says to the other something like, "Goodbye, comrade citizen," and this is the head of the secret police about to be shot with his own pistol. Cut. And then there are the heroes of the piece who are about to be, having been taken by surprise by the secret police, are about to have unpleasant things happen to them, and suddenly the radio communication from the secret police star battleships cuts off. The star battleships all have just blown up. And the hero of the piece, who has been sitting in the corner typing a tactical command into the computer program she had planted, looks up at the screen and says, "Oops." Oops is the Trojan virus that causes enemy starships to blow up successfully. It's a good example of why computer security can be important. So we have narrative tension, and then we have other things. We have chrome and color. The distinction between chrome and color: chrome are rules that enhance the theme, but don't really play a major role in what's going on. For example, if you are doing a game on the Battle of the Bulge, and you stick in this one German paratroop battalion, which actually dropped, which was almost completely ineffective in battle, and its function is it wanders around the board for a turn and disappears. It's chrome. It does something during that one turn. On the other hand, color is we are going to have all of these pieces on the board, and they represent historical figures. And instead of calling the historical figures 1, 2, 3, 4, we call them Lincoln, Grant, Meade, Davis, and we have little paintings. They've been dead long enough, you can get the paintings easily. And you have the nice colored paintings. That's color. It's not, the fact that you get the names right has no effect on the play of the game. Of course, more fancy than chrome, you could say we have theme. And as several of the people you've read said, what is the point of theme? Well, theme sells. If you have a spectacular theme line, you will get people to read, buy the game. There is a science fiction and sorcery game, which is the Star Empire of the whatever they were called, is attempting to invade the star cluster of the Warlocks. But if they even if they find the enemy capital, they may not be able to recognize it. And meanwhile, the other side sorcerers are going to be conjuring, all the usual D&D creatures, except somewhat large since they eat small planets. But this is a general idea. It's an incredible 2-paragraph sale line. It's theme. To keep sales up, you're the poor designer. You have to design a game that lives up to this in a reasonable way. I suppose it's possible, but you didn't hear me bet money on it. But it was theme sells, mechanics retains. If the game is good to play, in whatever sense good is meant, people will keep playing it, meaning they will give you word-of-mouth advertising, meaning your sales will go through the ceiling. Theme has a few other functions, though. One notion is that theme helps you remember the rules. If the mechanics of pawn A captures pawn B makes sense, Stratego at sea. The battleship captures the cruiser captures the destroyer. If the theme and color help you remember the rules, it's very positive. You should, however, realize that for people doing competitive play, the theme sort of becomes transparent very quickly. And piece level 1 captures 2, captures 3. It's Stratego. 8 captures 9, but guess what? 9 captures 1. The spy captures the general. And maybe we have special rules for mines. So having said this, there are different rules for different cases. But theme, for some players, will just go away. There are also designers who will give you theme, and the theme was pasted down on top. And if it was a good paste job, it's good. And if it's not such a great paste job, there are points where the mechanics don't quite make sense in terms of the theme, and you have to realize the designer maybe should have done a better job here. And the playtesters should have gone whack, whack, whack. This doesn't make sense in terms of your theme. Fix it. And there are ways of doing this. Okay. Someplace hidden in here are character identification and role-playing. And that's sort of gathering up the theme and clutching it firmly to your heart. That can make a good game. Some people will find this completely uninteresting. On the other hand, once upon a time, Dungeons and Dragons, instead of saying character identification and role gaming is the weirdo who shows up to play the Waterloo battle game dressed as the Emperor Napoleon. Oh yeah, dressed as the Emperor Napoleon. I've seen photographs. Instead of saying this is exotic and eccentric, we're going to say this is the core part of how we make a game. And since role gaming has done extremely well over the last 40 years, there's no doubt that you can make things work. Curiously, while there are vast numbers of superhero motion pictures and superhero comic books, a superhero board game, if you look for superhero board games, they're hard to find. And you can find superhero role-playing games like Champions, but superhero board games are much more difficult either to do or to locate. So this is the sort of thing that is going on. Let us move on from Greg Costikyan. We'll move on to Mr. Gracier. Gracier makes this, Gracier, one of our people we read makes the comment that he was somewhat left of center politically, and back when board wargamers tended to be politically conservative, a certain number of them, this led to interesting encounters. This sort of went away, though there is still the West Coast board wargame designer Jack Rady, who does very hard, carefully designed, complex games, and only occasionally does he mention that he's a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. Of course, he's doing World War II games in which his side won. While having mentioned this, though, Gracier makes a variety of suggestions about how you get a good game. And one of the suggestions is uncertainty. That is, if we are going to draw exploration cards, and the exploration cards are laid down face up in advance. So when I go to this square, I know I will find the volcano or whatever. that sort of kills the point of calling it exploration. It's like exploring the contents of your city map. You can find things like interesting restaurants, perhaps, but uncertainty adds to game interest. He makes an obscure reference to the GMT P500 system. This is a system that probably works better with board games rather than computer games because of the budget issues involved. The notion of the P500 system, I am a board wargaming company. I know reasonably accurately what it will cost me to get the game out the door so there's a box that I can ship someone. And I set the price, so for example, I need to pre-sell 500 copies of the game. And when I pre-sell, we go into production, and after a certain number of months, the game is released. Now, I pre-sold the game. People have paid me for it. Therefore, I am in essentially no risk whatsoever of losing money on production. And if you are running a somewhat marginal company, this can be useful. The reaction a few years ago was, well, it's a little hard to do this with computer games because the budgets are bigger. But then someone invented crowdfunding, and if you are crowdfunding something that is going to probably be very popular and you have a lot of fans, for example, one of the Girl Genius comic books paperbacks, you can crowdfund all sorts of stuff that will in fact sell, and you will have the money to pay for the basic investment. For board games or computer games, most of the capital costs are up front. If I want to sell another million copies of Doom 78, I have to run the presses longer, but the capital cost of this is very limited relative to all of the software and artwork and creative stuff and everything else I have to do. And so if you have something that is very heavily capital intensive at the front end, what Race here is talking about is the solution that puts the risk on someone else, not you. It's very creative. Oh, Race here then talks about kill your darlings. And there is a matching line which is somewhat similar. Torture your characters. These are both lines taken from writing fiction. And the notion in writing fiction is that you write, and at some point you will get an object that's beautifully crafted, it's evocative, it's wonderful, and it fits about as well as a cinder block trying to go down the drain on your sink. It just does not match everything else. And what you have to do, you have a rules module. It's a great module. It's very creative. It does not work with the game, and you have to yank it out and dump it back into your design notebook for some other game. And this is killing your darlings. And if you started out with the idea that you're designing a game around the cinder block, this can be quite painful. The other half of that, torture your characters, is the notion that you need the game to present challenge to the players. And if you are writing a novel, you do not want the novel where everything works immediately for the character. And you want various sorts of disaster. Torture need not be meant literally physical like in some of these romance novels. Torture can be the invention doesn't work, the financing doesn't come through, the other half dumps you 3 or 4 times in the series of the book. These are all unpleasant things you can do to characters, and they add dramatic interest. Challenge within reason adds dramatic interest. you can get carried away on this. There was the old D&D dungeon, Hell's Gate. Of Hell's Gate, it could be said that you could come out with a dungeon with 4 character levels and 6,000 gold pieces and 3 magic items. Of course, you went in as a 10th level character with 50,000 gold pieces and 20 magic items, and that's what you now have left. You see, the dungeon was run as a profit-making operation by the resident monsters. It's remarkable how few people think of the fact there must be a reason why monsters build dungeons, and it's obviously to make money now, isn't it? Okay. So you have all of these choices, which Race here talks about, and we can now shove ahead to a few of the other people. In particular, Branham and Breeze, and most of the write-ups on these people were very good. And so I am going to sort out from this a few pieces of advice. And one piece of advice is that sometimes you have to view a game as being like a bottle of good Bordeaux, a 2-year-old bottle. And while it is technically possible to drink it and not at your throat too badly, what you need to do with the game, like the bottle, is to put it on the shelf and let it age gracefully for some period of time. And as it ages gracefully, it will become a better game. You have seen an example of this with Puerto Rico, where there was a brilliant creative step, but the creative step was not the darling at the front end. Everyone plays the same role. The creative step was, gee, we have this game that doesn't work. Something has to be done to fix it. It got shoved on the shelf until the solution was found. Everyone plays the same role. But that wasn't the front-end solution. That was very much the back-end solution. Aging works. Breeze talks about art. And so, for example, if you play his game on the growth of coral reefs, it's a good game, I'm told. There are all of these little pieces of baby coral and slightly older coral and still older coral than that, and it is like the kitten pictures outside my office. How many of you have stopped to see those? No one? I'm heartbroken. In any event, you have all of the artwork, and each piece is slightly different from the next. And because all of the artwork is slightly individualized, there's no doubt that it's a baby coral or a slightly older coral or a big grown-up coral. You have something that is more attractive than it would otherwise have been. Now, how practical this is depends on your graphic skills. If you're me, this is not a bright idea. Some of you could sit there with a good fine point dark pen, and here is a sketch of a baby coral, and here is a slightly different sketch, and they can be turned out rather faster than the rest of the group can take the mailing labels and fasten them to the pennies, or however you're going to do this. So the notion is, art, make the thing pretty, and people will find it more interesting. Okay. Taylor talks about other game features. I'm going to skip to Taylor since I haven't mentioned him as much. And he talks about balance. And he talks about enjoyable to play. And as these people are not fancy, very complicated board war game fanatics, you will see plenty of discussion of fairly simple rules. The comment was, it should be possible to learn how to play the game completely without getting a bachelor's degree in play of this game. Now, they offer some very weird degrees out there: underwater basket weaving, Bitcoin mining. That's a master's degree from a school in Europe. But the rules, in their opinion, should not be so complicated that you can't swallow them fairly quickly and learn what they are. So that's sort of the standard. let's see. Dramatic struggle. That is, there has to be a real contest. It can't be obvious who's going to win or lose. We have mentioned before narrative tension. That's the literary idea. It does not translate too well into board games. The equivalent of narrative tension, we are playing chess, is we maneuver and we maneuver and maneuver, and at some point someone has made an inadequate calculation, and suddenly they are down a queen with no positional compensation. And gee, the game could drag out a very long time indeed if the defense is well laid out. However, what will usually happen if you manage to go down a queen and rook is that at the point you have done this, you don't drag things out, you just resign. And now, as called upon by several of these people, narrative tension says the highest tension point should be at the end of the game. Just as the highest tension point, except maybe for some cleanup, should be very much at the end of the novel. Well, the way this is done in many board games is that the side whose narrative tension has just fallen on their head like a bag of anvils resigns to avoid unnecessary pain. And the resignation works. It puts the narrative tension at the end, not by playing with the rules so that the game draws out and gets more and more tense, but because we relocate the end to the convenient point. Okay, this is the content issue, the historical content. For board war games, not so much or at all Eurogames, there is the notion of historical simulation. That is, you have the game, and one of the reasons people play it is to see history go before them and maybe see if different decisions would have led to different results. But there should be historical content. Now, for Eurogames, the historical content is somewhat limited. I did note the possibility of studying pirates by renting a copy of Cutthroat Island. This is not at all the same as buying a copy of Harlan's Seamanship, which is a book on ship navigation concerned entirely with navigating square-rigged ships, which are very complicated to handle, much more so than motorboats or simple toy sailboats. However, at some point, you can put in a lot of historical data, and some people will say this is very important, and some people will tell you, this is a really bad idea, you shouldn't do that. Okay, what else? Mayer gives the thought that ideas are on the breeze. They're all about you. And every so often, one will swim around and swim into focus right in front of you. And when it swims into focus, what you need to do is grab it and stick it into your notebook as an idea. And, of course, because some ideas are very much on the wing and there are whole flocks of copies of them, you should realize that there will be bunches of other people. I will take a simple example of this. There are collectible card games. One fine day, at least two major companies within about a month released collectible dice games. And someone else, this is not at the same time, released collectible combat miniatures games, which were sort of board games with plastic figures, except it's got collectible items. If you want the impressive, powerful units, you have to pay extra. Well, collectible was in the air, and once collectible was in the air, bunches of people were able to take advantage of the same idea in different ways. That, by the way, is why interacting with other designers is good. They may have an idea that, they aren't that taken with, but you see what to do with. In any event, I promised I would give you some advice of the great designers. That's why we did the interviews. The most important piece of advice reduces to one word. Playtesting. And that's it for today.